The first clue cost me $40. At the time, I would have told you it was just another launch fee on another Saturday morning. Nothing about it felt important. I grabbed a burnt cup of gas station coffee just outside town, the kind that's somehow too hot and too old at the same time, filled the truck, and headed toward the lake. The radio faded in and out once I left the highway, so I shut it off and spent the rest of the drive listening to the tires on the pavement. I'd made that trip so many times I barely noticed the turns anymore. My sister always joked I'd still get lost without road signs, but I wasn't so sure. The parking lot was already busy when I got there. A dad was trying to back a ski boat down the ramp, while his teenage daughter waved her arms like she was directing airplanes. Somebody near the picnic shelter had burned breakfast sausage just enough for the smell to drift across the water. A pair of older guys argued over whether live bait was cheating. It sounded like every summer morning I'd ever remembered. I can't remember if I was 9 or 10 the first time Dad brought me there. I do remember sitting on the tailgate eating potato chips while county crews poured concrete for the launch. Dad wasn't one of them. He'd shown up because someone needed another pair of hands. Back then, that wasn't unusual. If your neighbor was building something that belonged to the community, people simply came to help. Years later, he'd point toward that same boat ramp and say, "Funny thing about public property. People forget the public part." I'd nod like I understood, but honestly I never gave it much thought. The young guy working the payment booth looked like he was home from college for the summer. I'd seen him a few times before. "Morning," he said. $40. Ever get tired of saying that? I asked. He grinned. "Couple hundred times a weekend?" "Yeah, a little." I laughed and tapped my debit card against the reader. Buzz. Pause. Click. The receipt printer hesitated for a second before feeding out the thin strip of paper. I folded it without looking and stuffed it into my pocket. There were 3 trucks waiting behind me. I wasn't about to stand. They're reading receipts while everyone else wanted to launch. The morning turned out pretty average. I caught 2 decent bass, lost a lure on something buried underwater that definitely hadn't been there the last time, and spent a while drifting with the trolling motor off because it was quieter that way. Around lunchtime, I watched a little kid hook his own life jacket instead of the fish he'd been aiming for. His dad laughed so hard he nearly dropped his coffee. The kid wasn't embarrassed. He thought it was funny too. That's the sort of thing people actually remember from lake days. On the way back to the dock, I noticed a father tightening the straps on his trailer while his little boy stared at the payment booth. "Who owns this place?" the boy asked. His dad barely looked up. "The HOA, I guess." "Really? That's what everybody says." They climbed into the truck and drove away before I thought much about it. Funny thing is, I completely forgot that conversation by the time I reached the highway. It didn't come back to me until much later. I stopped at the same gas station on the way home because my wife had texted me to grab a bag of ice. While I was waiting in line, I reached into my pocket for my wallet and the folded launch receipt came out with it. I almost tossed it into the trash beside the counter. Instead, I unfolded it, mostly because the cashier was helping someone buy lottery tickets and I had nothing else to do. The business name across the top caught my attention. It wasn't the county. It wasn't Parks and Recreation. It was the Homeowners Association. Underneath was a taxpayer ID number I'd never noticed before. I stared at it for a few seconds. Maybe there was a perfectly ordinary explanation. Maybe the county leased the property. Maybe they'd contracted everything out years ago. I honestly didn't know. It just didn't match the story I'd grown up hearing. The cashier apologized for the delay as she handed me my change. "Lottery machine's slow today." "No worries." I folded the receipt again, paid for the ice, and headed home. That evening, I emptied my pockets onto the kitchen counter. My truck keys, a couple of quarters, the gas station receipt, the launch receipt. I tossed the gas station receipt into the trash without thinking. My hand started to do the same thing with the launch receipt, but for whatever reason I stopped. Maybe because of Dad. Maybe because of that little boy's question. Maybe because something about the paperwork just felt off. I slid it into the junk drawer where we kept instruction manuals, spare batteries, takeout menus from restaurants that had probably closed years ago, and all the other things nobody wanted but nobody threw away either. Then I shut the drawer, helped my wife get dinner on the table, and by bedtime, I'd almost forgotten the receipt was even there. Life has a way of pushing little questions into the background. The receipt stayed in the kitchen junk drawer while everything else demanded attention. I spent one Saturday replacing warped deck boards behind the house because I'd ignored them for 2 summers already. My wife reminded me, more than once, to schedule an oil change for the truck before another fishing trip. My sister borrowed our ladder and somehow managed to leave carrying fresh tomatoes from the garden too. By the time the next weekend rolled around, I'd almost forgotten the receipt completely. Saturday morning looked a lot like the last one. Same gas station, same burnt coffee, same stretch of road where the radio faded into static once I left the highway. The lake, though, was busier. A local base tournament had brought in trucks from 3 different counties, and the parking lot looked like a dealership specializing in pickup trucks and fiberglass boats. A man wearing a tournament jersey stood beside his trailer insisting to anyone who would listen that he'd already found the winning spot. His buddy rolled his eyes. You say that every tournament. One of these years I'll be right. I pulled into the launch line behind them. The young attendant recognized my truck before I rolled down the window. Back already? He asked. Fish haven't learned my schedule yet. Mine either. He laughed, reached for the card reader, and said the words I'd already come to expect. $40. Buzz. Pause. Click. The receipt printer hesitated in exactly the same place before feeding out another slip of paper. This time I glanced at it before folding it. Same homeowners association. Same taxpayer ID. Same format. I slipped it into my wallet instead of crumpling it into my pocket. I don't know why. It just seemed like a better place for it. The lake itself was crowded enough that I spent most of the morning tucked back in a quieter cove where the tournament boats never bothered going. I caught one decent base, missed another that probably wasn't as big as I'll remember it being 10 years from now, and drifted for a while with the trolling motor off. Around noon, I headed back toward the dock. That's when I noticed Rebecca for the first time, although I didn't know her name yet. She was standing near the entrance talking with a couple who'd somehow managed to unfold a campground map upside down. She smiled, turned it around for them, pointed toward another road, and said, "You're close. Just keep going another mile, and you'll see the sign." They thanked her, climbed back into their SUV, and drove away. A minute later, she answered a question from a family unloading kayaks about where the nearest public restroom was. Nothing about either conversation seemed remarkable. She wasn't acting like someone protecting private property. She looked like somebody answering the same questions she'd answered hundreds of times before. As I walked past, she noticed the receipt still sticking out of my wallet. "If you come here very often," she said, handing me a glossy brochure, "the annual membership usually saves people some money." "Thanks," I said, slipping it under my arm with the rest of my gear. "I'll take a look." The brochure rode home on the passenger seat beside an empty coffee cup and a half-finished bag of sunflower seeds. I forgot about it until later that afternoon while unloading the truck. My wife picked it up from the kitchen counter. "Thinking about joining?" she asked. "Not sure. You fish there enough." "Maybe." I hesitated. "Something's been bugging me." She looked up. "The brochure." "Not exactly. More the receipt." She gave me the kind of smile that politely says, "I'm listening, but I'm not sure why this matters." Yet, honestly, I wasn't sure either. After dinner, while she settled into the living room with one of those home renovation shows she liked, I carried my laptop to the dining room table and searched for the Homeowners Association online. Everything looked ordinary. Annual meeting notices, landscaping contracts, pool hours, election minutes. Their corporate registration was active. Nothing looked suspicious. If I'd stopped there, that probably would have been the end of it. But curiosity got the better of me, and I opened the county parcel map. Within about 5 minutes, I was completely lost. Colored property lines overlapped one another. Tiny parcel numbers crowded together until I couldn't tell where one ended and another began. I zoomed in, then back out, then in again. Somehow it only got more confusing. Dad would have hated every second of it. He used to keep old survey maps folded inside a binder in the garage. Paper never freezes, he'd always say whenever a computer frustrated him. I caught myself laughing at the memory before shutting the laptop. Maybe there really was a lease somewhere explaining everything. Maybe the county had officially turned operations over years ago, and I'd simply missed the paperwork. I wasn't ready to jump to any conclusions. Before heading to bed, I opened the junk drawer, took out the first receipt, laid it beside the second one, and added the membership brochure. Then I found an old manila folder left over from tax season, slipped everything inside, wrote Lake across the tab with a black marker, and tucked it onto the shelf in the hall closet. Looking back, it still amazes me how casually I did that. At the time, I honestly thought I was putting away a few papers I'd probably never look at again. By the time I thought about the folder again, almost 3 weeks had gone by. That's usually how life works. A question nags at you for a day or two, then the grass needs mowing, somebody calls asking for help, the truck starts making a noise you've been ignoring, and before you know it, the question gets buried under everything else. My neighbor and I spent one Saturday replacing a section of fence that a summer storm had knocked flat. My wife convinced me to finally clean out the garage, which mostly turned into moving old boxes from one corner to another before deciding they weren't ready to be thrown away after all. Somewhere in the middle of all that, the lake kept pulling me back. Maybe it was the fishing. Maybe it was just the excuse to disappear for half a day. I honestly couldn't tell you. The base tournament crowds were gone by then, and the parking lot felt quieter. A retired couple sat outside their camper, sharing the newspaper section by section. Somebody's portable radio was playing old country music softly enough that you could hear it only when the wind shifted. A little boy spent 5 minutes trying to skip rocks while his grandfather quietly skipped 3 in a row without saying a word. The young attendant smiled when my truck rolled up. "You're becoming one of our regulars," he said. "Pretty sure I crossed that line years ago." He laughed. "Fair enough. $40. Buzz. Pause. Click. This time I didn't shove the receipt into my pocket. I folded it once and slipped it into my wallet beside the other two. The attendant noticed. "You saving those?" he asked. "Yeah." "Any particular reason?" I shrugged. "Not really. Just feels like I should. Wish I'd saved some of my paychecks instead," he joked. "Would have made college a lot easier." We both laughed, and I headed toward the dock. The fishing wasn't much to brag about. I changed lures more often than I probably needed to, blamed the weather twice, and finally admitted the fish simply weren't interested in helping my confidence that morning. Around lunchtime, I drifted back toward the launch and noticed a delivery truck parked beside the office. Rebecca was helping unload cases of bottled water when the bottom of one cardboard box suddenly gave way. Plastic bottles scattered across the pavement in every direction. 2 teenagers waiting to launch their jet skis immediately started chasing them before they rolled into the parking lot. Rebecca laughed, shook her head, and thanked them. "Guess inventory's happening early today," she said. Even the delivery driver laughed. It lasted maybe 30 seconds before everyone went back to what they were doing. Looking back, that's one of the reasons none of this ever felt like some giant conspiracy. Everything I saw out there looked normal. People solved little problems. They joked with each other. They went back to work. On the drive home, I passed the county records office and, almost on impulse, pulled into the parking lot. I hadn't planned on stopping. I figured maybe someone could help me understand the parcel maps that still looked like a bowl of spaghetti every time I opened them. Inside, the building smelled faintly of old paper and furniture polish. The woman behind the counter smiled when I admitted I wasn't entirely sure what I was looking for. "That's more common than you'd think," she said. After a few minutes, she introduced me to an attorney who happened to be reviewing property records for another client. Her name was Claire Donnelly. She wasn't dramatic. No expensive suit. No booming courtroom voice. Just a legal pad, a stack of files, and somebody who listened more than she talked. I explained the boat ramp, Dad helping build it years ago, the receipts I'd started saving, and how the parcel maps didn't seem to answer the question I thought I was asking. Claire waited until I finished before speaking. "Do you still have every receipt?" she asked. "3 so far." "Good." I must have looked puzzled because she smiled. "Most people throw away the boring documents. Should I keep doing that?" "I'd keep every receipt from now on, even if nothing comes of it. Especially then." She folded her hands on the desk. "Paperwork usually tells the truth before people realize there's a story." I sat there thinking about that for a second. It wasn't the sort of sentence somebody rehearses. It sounded more like something she'd learned after years of looking through old files. "Should I ask the HOA about the fees?" I finally said. Claire shook her head. "Not yet." "Why?" "Because right now you're collecting information." She reached for her legal pad and wrote down a few county departments. "Planning, engineering, parks and recreation, public works. Start with the records," she said, sliding the paper across the desk. "If there's a lease, an operating agreement, or anything giving the HOA that authority, there's a decent chance it left a paper trail somewhere." Before I left, she added one more thing almost as an afterthought. "Don't change your routine." "My routine?" "Keep fishing if that's what you'd normally do. Keep your receipts. Let the timeline build itself." Driving home, I stopped for another coffee even though I didn't need one. I sat in the parking lot for a minute, pulled the 3 receipts out of my wallet, and laid them across the center console in order. They looked almost identical. 3 ordinary Saturdays. 3 $40 payments. 3 little slips of paper most people would have thrown away before getting home. I gathered them back up, slipped them into the folder waiting in the hall closet later that evening. And for the first time it occurred to me that I wasn't really collecting receipts anymore. I was quietly collecting time. Claire wasn't the kind of attorney who called just to sound busy. After our first meeting, nearly 2 weeks passed without hearing from her. At first I caught myself wondering if she'd forgotten about the whole thing. Then I figured no news probably meant she was doing exactly what she'd said she'd do, looking through records instead of making guesses. Life filled the space in between. I replaced a loose section of gutter after another summer storm. My wife convinced me we should finally wash the windows, even though we'd probably spend the next week complaining every bird in the county had picked ours to aim at. One evening the power blinked off for 15 minutes, and half the neighborhood wandered out onto their front porches to see if everyone else had lost electricity too. Somebody blamed squirrels. Somebody blamed the utility company. By the time anybody decided whose fault it probably was, the lights came back on. A few days later, I headed to the lake earlier than usual. The sun had barely cleared the trees, and there was still a little fog hanging over the water. A maintenance crew was trimming weeds along the entrance road, while someone decorated the picnic shelter with balloons for what looked like a family reunion. The young attendant looked up as I rolled down my window. "Starting before everybody else?" he asked. "That's the plan. Wish I could." He smiled. $40. Buzz. Pause. Click. I folded the receipt without looking. By then the motion had become automatic. Wallet. Fold. Folder behind the seat. As I walked toward the dock, I spotted Rebecca kneeling beside one of the flower beds near the office. She was pulling weeds with a pair of gardening gloves while giving directions to an older couple trying to find a nearby hiking trail. Every few minutes, she'd brush the dirt off her hands, point down the road, then go right back to the flowers. Watching her, it occurred to me that I'd never actually seen her sitting still. She always seemed to be doing something. I spent a few quiet hours on the lake without much luck. The fish weren't cooperating, but honestly, I didn't mind. Around noon, the wind shifted, dark clouds rolled across the water, and everybody suddenly reached the same conclusion at the same time. Boats started heading back toward the ramp from every direction. By the time I got the trailer hooked up, the first heavy drops were already hitting the windshield. The rain followed me all the way home. Since the weather ruined any plans to work outside, I wandered into the garage looking for an extension cord I'd misplaced weeks earlier. I never did find the cord. Instead, I noticed a dusty cardboard box tucked behind Dad's old tackle cabinet. Across the top, in faded black marker, were 2 words, Lake Access. I honestly couldn't remember the last time I'd opened it. Maybe after Dad passed away. Maybe not even then. I carried it inside and spread everything across the dining room table. Most of it looked exactly like something Dad would save. Receipts for gravel deliveries, old invoices, hand-drawn sketches, newspaper clippings with yellowed edges. Then I found a thick 3-ring binder filled with photographs from the original construction of the boat ramp. There was Dad standing beside county workers with a shovel over his shoulder, looking about 20 years younger than I remembered him. Another picture showed wet concrete being smoothed while pickup trucks waited. Along the roadside, tucked inside the front cover, was a yellow note written in his familiar block handwriting. It simply said, "People argue about land. Records don't." I sat there for a minute smiling at that sentence. It sounded exactly like him. Dad wasn't interested in winning arguments. He trusted paperwork more than opinions every single time. The following Monday, I called Claire. "I think I found something you should see," I told her. She cleared one end of her conference table while I unpacked the binder. For nearly half an hour, she worked through it without saying much. Every so often, she'd stop at a photograph, compare it with an old survey, jot down a note, then keep turning pages. Finally, she closed the binder and rested both hands on top of it. "Your dad was organized. Borderline obsessive." "Today," she smiled. "That's a compliment." I waited for her to explain what she'd found, but instead she asked, "Have you located anything showing how the Homeowners Association received authority to collect launch fees?" "No, neither have I." She didn't sound disappointed. She sounded thoughtful. The ownership question is becoming much clearer now, she said, tapping the binder lightly. These records line up with the county files you've already found, so we know who built it, and we have a much better picture of who owns it. She paused before continuing. But ownership and operating authority aren't automatically the same thing. That wasn't something I'd really considered before. So what's missing? She looked toward the stack of receipts I'd been collecting all summer. The bridge. The bridge. Some document connecting a public boat ramp to the HOA's authority to collect $40 launch fees. She shrugged slightly. Maybe it's a lease. Maybe an operating agreement. Maybe something else entirely. I honestly don't know yet. I appreciated hearing that. She wasn't pretending to have the answer before the records did. As I packed everything back into the box, it struck me that the mystery had become much smaller than when this all started. We weren't trying to figure out who owned the lake anymore. We weren't even trying to figure out who built the ramp. We were looking for one very specific piece of paperwork. And for the first time, it felt like we knew exactly what that missing piece was supposed to look like. The next time I met Claire, it wasn't in her office. She suggested a small coffee shop a few blocks from the courthouse because, as she put it, the coffee's better and nobody interrupts us every 5 minutes. She wasn't wrong about the coffee. Whether it was actually better or we'd both just gotten used to courthouse coffee, I couldn't say. We found a table near the window while people drifted in and out carrying breakfast sandwiches before work. Claire spread a yellow legal pad across the table but left it blank for a minute. She looked more like someone organizing her thoughts than someone preparing to deliver an answer. I've been through another round of county records, she said. Find anything? She gave the slightest shake of her head. Not exactly. I waited. She always seemed comfortable letting silence sit for a few seconds before speaking again. If the homeowners association has authority to collect launch fees, she said, there should be something connecting the county to that authority. A lease? Maybe. An agreement? Maybe. She smiled a little. I use the word maybe a lot because records don't always follow the path we expect. I laughed. You're careful. Occupational hazard. She turned the legal pad toward me and wrote 3 words in a column. Lease. Operating agreement. Easement. Those are the first places I'd expect authority to show up. And if none of them exist? She rested the pen on the paper without answering immediately. Then we'd keep asking why. That was probably the shortest legal strategy meeting I'd ever imagined. There wasn't any dramatic breakthrough. No secret document slid across the table. Just another reminder that unanswered questions sometimes matter as much as answered ones. Before we left, Claire surprised me by saying, "Don't change your weekends." Meaning, go fishing. I laughed again. That's legal advice? No. She smiled over the rim of her coffee cup. It's practical advice. People remember ordinary routines. They make good timelines. The following Saturday looked almost too perfect to stay indoors. The humidity had finally backed off, and the lake was full of families trying to squeeze every bit they could out of the remaining summer. A church youth group was loading canoes near one end of the parking lot, while a local bass club had claimed the other. Somebody had set up a folding table selling homemade cookies to raise money for high school band uniforms. I bought 2 without really thinking about it. One disappeared before I even reached the boat. The young attendant saw me coming and grinned. "Still collecting receipts?" he asked before I even rolled down the window. "Apparently I am. You're probably my only customer who does." Occupational habit now. "What occupation?" I smiled. "Good question. $40. Buzz. Pause. Click. The receipt joined the others inside my wallet. By then it felt almost automatic, like buckling a seatbelt. The morning passed quietly. Fishing wasn't spectacular, but it didn't need to be. Around midday, I noticed Rebecca near the dock helping a little girl whose baseball cap had blown into the shallow water. The girl's mother apologized over and over, but Rebecca simply waded in far enough to grab the muddy hat, rinsed it with a hose beside the maintenance building, and handed it back with a smile. The little girl put it on immediately, even though it was still dripping. Her mother thanked her again. Rebecca just waved and walked back toward the office carrying a clipboard under one arm. It struck me that I'd still never seen her arguing with anyone. If anything, she spent most of her time solving tiny problems nobody else wanted to deal with. That afternoon, after cleaning the boat and putting everything away, I checked my mailbox. Mixed between grocery store flyers and an electric bill was a plain envelope from the county. Inside were responses to a few public records requests Claire had helped me submit. I carried them inside without opening them. My wife glanced over from the kitchen. Anything interesting? We'll find out. We sat at the dining room table together while I worked through the pages one by one. Most of it was exactly what I'd expected: copies of property records, survey references, department routing notes. Then I reached the summary page. I read it once. Then I read it again. What is it? My wife asked. I slid the paper across the table. The county had searched for any lease authorizing the homeowners association to operate the public boat ramp. None located. It had searched for any operating agreement. None located. It had searched for any recorded easement transferring operational responsibility. None located. I leaned back in the chair without saying anything for a while. That wasn't proof something didn't exist somewhere else. It wasn't even close. Claire had warned me against jumping ahead of the paperwork. But it was the first time the county records themselves had quietly answered one of our questions. My wife looked at me. Is that good? I don't know yet. And that was the honest answer. We still didn't know whether another office had different files. We didn't know whether something had been misplaced decades ago. We didn't know whether there was an explanation nobody had found yet. But for the first time since I'd unfolded that receipt at the gas station, it felt like the county was asking the same question I was. By the time August rolled around, saving receipts had become part of my routine without me really thinking about it anymore. Wallet, receipt, folder. It took maybe 5 seconds every trip. Funny how little habits form. You do something twice because you're curious, then 10 times because it simply feels strange not to. I wasn't looking for some dramatic breakthrough every weekend. Mostly I just wanted to fish. Everything else happened around that. The lake had settled into its usual late summer rhythm. Families still came out, but the crowds were a little smaller now that school supplies had started filling the front aisles at every grocery store in town. The mornings stayed busy, but by early afternoon you could usually find quiet stretches of water where the only sounds were insects buzzing through the reeds and the occasional splash of a fish chasing bait near the shoreline. When I pulled into the entrance that Saturday, I noticed something different before I even reached the payment booth. A white county pickup sat off to one side near the maintenance building. Nothing unusual about county trucks being around public property, but this one wasn't hauling equipment. 2 employees stood beside it talking while one of them held a camera. The young attendant greeted me the same way he always did. Morning. Morning. $40. Buzz. Pause. Click. He handed over the receipt, then glanced toward the county truck. Guess they're inspecting something today. Looks that way. He shrugged. Nobody tells me much. I tucked the receipt into my wallet and drove toward the parking area. As I unloaded the boat, I watched the county employees from a distance. They weren't stopping visitors or asking questions. One of them photographed the entrance sign, then the payment booth, then the fee schedule posted beside the window. The other made a few notes on a clipboard before they both walked toward the dock at an easy pace. Nothing about it looked confrontational. If anything, they seemed careful not to get in anybody's way. Rebecca stepped outside the office carrying a case of bottled water. She walked over, offered each of them a bottle, exchanged a few words I couldn't hear, and pointed toward another section of the property. They thanked her and continued walking. It all seemed perfectly ordinary. Later that afternoon, I called Claire. County employees were photographing the payment booth today, I told her. She was quiet for a second. Did they speak with you? No. Did they stop anyone from launching? No. Another brief pause. I think they're documenting the operation now. I noticed the word she chose. You think? I do. She gave a small laugh. I'd rather say I think than pretend I know something I don't. That sounded exactly like Claire. Could it mean they're investigating? I asked. Maybe. There was that word again. Or maybe they're simply updating records. Either way, don't read more into it than the documents eventually support. The next couple of weekends followed almost the same pattern. I'd fish for a few hours, come back toward the dock, and notice another county vehicle. Somewhere nearby. One Saturday, an employee measured distances between signs with a long measuring wheel. Another weekend, someone took photographs from different angles around the launch area. They weren't there all day, usually an hour or 2 at most. People noticed them, then went back to whatever they'd been doing. Life around the lake kept moving. One afternoon, I watched a little boy drop his ice cream cone before he'd taken a single bite. He stood there staring at it on the pavement like he'd just witnessed a personal tragedy. Before his parents could even react, Rebecca disappeared into the office and came back a minute later, holding another cone from a small freezer inside. The boy's face changed instantly. His parents offered to pay her, but she waved them off. Happens all the time, she said. Little moments like that made it harder to imagine anyone intentionally doing something wrong. People are rarely as simple as heroes or villains. Most of the time, they're just trying to get through another busy Saturday. A few days later, Claire asked if I wanted to meet for lunch instead of coffee. We ended up at a sandwich shop across from the courthouse where the tables wobbled slightly unless you folded a napkin under one leg. She already had my growing stack of receipts spread across the table beside copies of the county responses we'd received. Notice something? She asked. I looked at the dates, then back at the county notes. It took me a second before I saw it. They're lining up. She nodded. Your receipts establish when fees were collected. She tapped another page. County employees began documenting the operation afterward. Is that important? It creates two independent timelines. She leaned back. One from you, one from the county. She didn't sound excited. If anything, she sounded satisfied that the paperwork was starting to organize itself naturally instead of needing anyone to force it into place. Before we left, she gathered everything back into neat stacks. Keep doing exactly what you've been doing. Fishing, she smiled, and saving boring little receipts. Driving home, I thought about how strange that sounded. A few months earlier, I'd almost thrown the very first one into a trash can beside the gas station counter. Now those same slips of paper had quietly become part of a timeline neither Claire nor I had created. We were simply watching it grow, one ordinary Saturday at a time. By then, the county pickups didn't catch anyone's attention anymore. The first couple of visits had people slowing down to watch what was happening. A month later, they blended into the background like the maintenance crews cutting grass or the garbage truck emptying trash cans. Whatever the county was doing, they weren't making a show of it. Neither was anyone else. I kept doing what Claire had suggested from the beginning. I fished. I paid the $40. I folded the receipt. I drove home. The routine had become so automatic that one Saturday, I caught myself reaching for the receipt before the printer had even finished spitting it out. The young attendant laughed. You're getting faster than the machine. Guess I've had some practice. You probably have more of those receipts than I do. I wouldn't be surprised. He handed it over with a grin. $40 well documented. Something like that. Buzz. Pause. Click. The little printer still hesitated in the exact same place every single time. Funny the things your brain starts noticing after enough repetition. Out on the water, fishing wasn't much different from any other August weekend. The sun climbed higher than I'd expected, and by late morning most of the fish seemed content to disappear somewhere cooler than where I was looking. I spent nearly an hour drifting near a line of fallen trees, more interested in watching a pair of ospreys circle overhead than worrying about what was on the end of my fishing line. Some days that's enough. Not every trip needs a cooler full of fish to feel worthwhile. When I headed back toward the dock, I noticed another county employee standing near the payment booth talking with Rebecca. From where I parked, I couldn't hear the conversation, but I could see her walk inside the office and come back carrying a thick 3-ring binder. She handed it over, and the employee flipped through a few pages while she pointed to something near the middle. They talked for another minute before he thanked her and returned the binder. She tucked it under one arm and went back inside. There wasn't any arguing. Nobody looked upset. If anything, it reminded me of someone answering questions during a routine inspection. I loaded the boat, wiped down the trailer lights, and drove home without giving it much more thought. Later that week, Claire called. Have you noticed more county visits? She asked. A few. Anything unusual? I thought about it for a second. Rebecca showed one employee a binder. Interesting. Do you think it was the agreement you've been looking for? Claire was quiet just long enough for me to know she was choosing her words carefully. Maybe, she said. Or maybe it was maintenance records. Financial records. Vendor invoices. We don't know. I guess not. Remember, seeing paperwork and knowing what paperwork says are two different things. I'd heard enough from Claire by then to recognize when she was steering me away from making assumptions. It wasn't frustrating anymore. It was reassuring. She wasn't trying to fit facts into a story. She wanted the story to come from the facts. A few days later we met again, this time in her office. She had my growing folder spread across one side of the conference table. Receipts, county responses, parcel maps, Dad's construction photographs. She added a legal pad beside them and drew 2 simple columns. Operations, she said, writing the word at the top of one side. Then she wrote authority above the other. Those aren't automatically the same thing. I nodded. The HOA clearly operates parts of the property, she continued. We've seen employees working there. We've seen maintenance. We've seen visitors getting information. None of that's in question. She tapped the empty column labeled authority. This is still what we're trying to understand. Whether someone officially gave them permission to collect fees. Exactly. She didn't sound excited. She sounded patient. The distinction seemed obvious once she explained it, but I wasn't sure I would have thought of it on my own. On Saturday, I returned to the lake. Again, a local charity-based tournament had filled half the parking lot with wrapped boats covered in sponsor logos. Volunteers stood beneath pop-up tents selling hot dogs and bottled water to raise money for the volunteer fire department. Somebody's golden retriever wandered through the crowd wearing a red bandana and accepted attention from just about everyone willing to stop petting him. Near the payment booth, a county employee picked up one of the glossy membership brochures Rebecca had been handing out all summer. He tucked it into a folder before walking toward his truck. I noticed it mostly because it seemed like such an ordinary thing to save. Then I smiled to myself. Maybe he was collecting paperwork the same way I was. That evening I spread everything across my own dining room table again. Dad's binder sat beside the growing stack of receipts. The brochures rested next to county responses. Survey maps covered one corner, while handwritten notes filled another. My wife walked in carrying 2 glasses of iced tea and looked over the collection. You've officially taken over the whole table. Looks that way. She studied everything for a moment before asking, do you think you're close? I looked at the papers without answering right away. Finally, I shook my head. Closer than when we started. That's not the same thing. No. I picked up one of the receipts and turned it over absent-mindedly. We're still waiting for one piece of paper. She smiled. The one that either exists or doesn't. Exactly. As the sun disappeared outside the kitchen window, I gathered everything back into the folder except for the newest receipt, which I left on the table for another minute. It looked almost identical to every other one I'd saved that summer. The difference wasn't in the receipt anymore. The difference was that each passing week made the missing document feel just a little harder to explain. By the middle of August, summer had started feeling like it was running out of time. You could see it in little ways. School buses were back on the roads for practice runs. Grocery stores had stacks of notebooks where beach towels had been a month earlier. Even the mornings at the lake felt different. They were still busy, but people seemed more aware that there weren't many weekends left before football games replaced fishing trips. I pulled into the entrance just after sunrise. The young attendant looked up from his phone and smiled when he recognized my truck. Morning. Morning. $40. Buzz. Pause. Click. He handed me the receipt before grinning. You still keeping every one of these? Every single one. He laughed. If anybody ever asks how your summer went, you've got paperwork to prove it. Guess I do. I slipped the receipt into my wallet without another thought. The motion had become so familiar that I barely noticed doing it anymore. Rebecca was already outside the office carrying 2 cardboard boxes filled with brochures and what looked like bottled sunscreen for visitors. She balanced a coffee cup on top of one box while trying to unlock the office door at the same time. The cup tipped just enough to splash a little coffee onto the lid. She sighed, laughed at herself, wiped it away with her sleeve, and kept going. It wasn't much of a moment, but somehow it made her seem even more ordinary than before. Not somebody running some grand operation. Just another person trying to manage a busy Saturday before finishing her first cup of coffee. I spent the morning drifting along the eastern shoreline where the water stayed cooler beneath a line of old oak trees. The fishing wasn't memorable. I caught one small bass that probably weighed less than the lure I'd used to catch it, then spent nearly an hour watching turtles climb onto a half-submerged log every time the sun came out. At one point, I realized I'd forgotten to pack mustard for the sandwich my wife had made. She always packed mustard in those little restaurant packets because I complained the bottle leaked into the cooler once years ago. Somehow she'd forgotten this time. I ate the sandwich anyway. It wasn't nearly as bad as I'd expected. Funny the details your brain hangs on to. On the way back toward the dock, I noticed the county truck again. By now, nobody even turned to look anymore. 2 employees walked slowly around the payment booth, stopping occasionally to compare notes. Rebecca stood with them for a few minutes. answering what appeared to be ordinary questions before pointing toward the maintenance building. Then everyone went back to what they were doing. No raised voices. No dramatic confrontation. Just another quiet Saturday. A couple of days later, Claire asked if I could stop by her office after work. When I arrived, she already had the conference table covered with papers. My receipts stretched across one side in date order. Dad's photographs sat beside county parcel maps. The public record responses rested in another stack. She'd even laid the membership brochure beside the first receipt from the gas station. "That's quite a collection," I said. "It's really just one timeline," she answered. She walked slowly around the table as she spoke. "Your first receipt." She tapped the paper gently. Then the brochure. Another tap. "County record requests." Another. "Your father's construction records." Another. "County site visits." She looked back toward me. "Notice what's missing?" I already knew the answer. "The authority document." She nodded. "We've looked for a lease." Nothing. "An operating agreement." Nothing. "A recorded easement transferring authority." Nothing. Claire rested both hands on the edge of the table. "I'm not saying one doesn't exist somewhere." There was that careful wording again. "I'm saying that if it exists, nobody we've asked has produced it." That sentence stayed with me all the way home. Not because it sounded dramatic. Quite the opposite. It sounded almost disappointingly ordinary. Sometimes the biggest answer isn't a surprising document that suddenly appears. Sometimes it's the document that never does. The following Saturday, I stopped for coffee before heading to the lake and ended up sharing a picnic table outside the gas station with an older man wearing a faded fishing hat covered in patches from tournaments that probably happened 20 years ago. He noticed my tackle bag and asked where I was headed. We talked about weather, bait prices, and whether the lake level looked lower than normal. Before leaving, he smiled and said, "I've been launching there since before my knees started complaining every morning." I laughed. "Long time. Long enough." He picked up his coffee. "Funny thing is, people always assume things have always been the way they are now." I thought about that during the drive. Maybe he meant the fishing. Maybe he meant the crowds. Maybe he meant something else entirely. I never asked. That afternoon, the lake looked almost exactly as it had all summer. Families loaded coolers. Children chased ducks along the shoreline until their parents reminded them not to. The payment booth stayed open. The fee sign still stood beside it. Rebecca answered questions from visitors while the young attendant collected another line of $40 payments. If someone had visited only that afternoon, nothing would have looked unusual at all. Yet as I drove home with another receipt tucked inside my wallet, I realized something had quietly changed, not at the lake, but in my own thinking. Months earlier, I'd assumed there had to be paperwork somewhere explaining everything. Now, after every record request, every conversation, every old photograph, every county visit, and every careful answer from Claire, I wasn't waiting for a dramatic revelation anymore. I was simply waiting to see whether anyone, anywhere, could produce the one document that should have appeared long before now. And with each passing week, the silence surrounding that missing piece of paper was beginning to sound like an answer all by itself. Claire called on a Tuesday afternoon while I was replacing the air filter in the truck. I almost let the call go to voicemail because my hands were dirty, but something told me to answer anyway. "You have a few minutes?" she asked. "Sure. I think the county has finished its review." Even then, she didn't sound excited. She sounded careful, the same way she always had. "Can you meet me?" We agreed on the courthouse an hour later. When I walked into her office, the conference table wasn't covered with papers the way it usually was. Everything had been stacked neatly into one organized file. My receipts sat together. Dad's construction binder rested beside them. The county responses were clipped into a single packet. Claire slid one document toward me. "This is the review summary the county released." I read it slowly. There wasn't a dramatic headline. No bold letters announcing a scandal. Just a straightforward explanation written in the plain language government offices seemed to prefer. The boat ramp had been confirmed as county property open for public use. The Homeowners Association had been collecting launch fees. During the county's review, departments searched for documentation authorizing that collection. No lease was located. No recorded easement granting operational authority was located. No operating agreement transferring fee collection authority was located. The review recommended that fee collection stop until proper legal authority could be established. I reached the bottom of the page and looked back at Claire. "That's it." She smiled slightly. Sometimes that's it. No lawsuit. Not from this review. No accusations. The county answered the question it was asked. I sat quietly for a moment. After months of receipts, photographs, parcel maps, public record requests, and quiet conversations, the answer fit onto only a few pages. It almost felt strange. Claire gathered the papers into one stack again. You know what I keep thinking about? She asked. What? That first receipt. I laughed. The one I almost threw away. She nodded. Most people would have. We left the courthouse and walked across the street to the same coffee shop where we'd met weeks earlier. Nothing about the place had changed. Somebody was working on a laptop near the window. An older couple shared a blueberry muffin at the next table. The coffee still tasted better than the courthouse coffee. Claire stirred hers absent-mindedly before looking up. You never accused anyone. I didn't know enough to. You never confronted the HOA. You told me not to. You listened. I shrugged. Seemed easier than making assumptions. She smiled. It usually is. We finished our coffee talking about completely unrelated things. Weekend plans. Fishing. Whether summer had gone by faster than either of us expected. It felt good not to discuss paperwork for a while. A few days later I decided to visit the lake again. Not because I expected anything new, but because that's where this whole thing had started. As I turned into the entrance, something immediately looked different even before I could explain why. Then I realized what it was. The fee sign beside the payment booth was gone. The card reader wasn't sitting on the counter anymore. The booth itself stood open, but nobody was collecting $40 launch fees. A county maintenance crew was removing a few remaining brackets from the post where the sign had been mounted. One employee rolled up electrical cable while another loaded equipment into the back of a pickup. There wasn't a crowd watching. Nobody applauded. People launched their boats the same way they always had. They backed down the ramp, unhooked trailers, and headed out onto the water. Life moved forward with surprising ease. I spotted Rebecca near the office talking with one of the county employees. She looked tired, probably after another long summer, but otherwise no different than she'd looked every other weekend. As I walked past carrying my tackle bag, our eyes met for a second. She gave a small nod. I nodded back. Neither of us said anything. There didn't seem to be anything that needed saying. That afternoon, I fished for a couple of hours, although I honestly couldn't tell you whether I caught much. My mind kept wandering back to the first day I'd unfolded that receipt inside the gas station while waiting behind someone buying lottery tickets. Such a small moment. So easy to miss. When I got home, I carried Dad's old binder out to the dining room table one last time. I slipped the very first receipt into a clear plastic sleeve behind the construction photographs. It seemed like the right place for it. Not because it proved somebody had won. It simply completed the story. A few weeks later, my nephew asked if I'd take him fishing before school started. As we backed the trailer toward the same ramp, he pointed toward the entrance. Wasn't there a fee sign right there? There was. What happened? I smiled without taking my eyes off the mirrors. Turns out it didn't belong there. He accepted that answer without another question. Kids are funny that way. They don't always need every detail. We spent the rest of the morning catching more bluegill than bass, eating slightly squashed peanut butter sandwiches, and laughing when one fish somehow managed to spit the hook and splash both of us at the same time. Driving home, I realized something I hadn't expected. I didn't feel like I'd beaten anyone. I didn't feel angry. I didn't even feel particularly proud. Mostly, I felt grateful that my father had been the kind of man who saved old papers, wrote careful notes in the margins, and believed records mattered more than arguments. If he'd been alive, he probably would have looked at that first receipt, nodded once, and quietly started looking through his binder before saying a word. In the end, that's really what solved everything. Not speeches, not accusations, just ordinary people asking ordinary questions and allowing the paperwork to answer them. And for the first time all summer, there wasn't anything left to investigate.